Welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us. My name is Panagiotis Poimenidis, and I am a member of RCN History of Nursing Forum Committee. I'm really pleased to introduce this event, which is part of a series linked to RCN Library and Archive exhibition on history of emotion and nursing. The History of Nursing Forum have worked closely with the Library and Archive Service on the exhibition and series of events. If you are an RCN member, please do join the forum in my RCN. We will paste the link in the chat. Today, we're exploring the life and ideas of Cicely Saunders, the pioneer of end-of-life care. We have two speakers, and this will be followed by a chance to ask questions. I'm speaking to you from St. Thomas's Hospital, where Cicely Saunders trained at Nightingale School of Nursing from 1940 to 1944. Our first speaker is Joseph Wood, PhD candidate at the University of Glasgow. He will be talking about his research on the concept of total pain in Saunders' life and work.
Hopefully you can see that. That's all right? Yeah? Good. I'm going to start with a quote. When our patients arrive, they often tell such a story as this, from a woman of 54 with carcinoma of cervix and metastases. Well, doctor, the pain began in my back, but now it seems that all of me is wrong. She described various symptoms, her increasing weakness and incontinence, and went on, it's all round me. I just wanted to cry for the pills and the injections, but I knew I mustn't. My husband and son were marvelous, but they were having to stay off work and lose their money. No one seemed to understand, and I began to feel that all the world was against me. Her pain included not only her physical suffering, but also her emotional and mental suffering, her social problems, and her spiritual need for understanding and security. So this is in 1964 how Cicely Saunders, champion of the modern hospice movement, introduced her idea of total pain, which has since become a key term within hospice, as well as what has become the wider specialty of palliative and end-of-life care. It might surprise you that it is possible to effectively do a PhD on just those two words, total pain, which is, as Panos said, what I'm doing at the University of Glasgow, funded by the Scottish Graduate School for Arts and Humanities. My PhD is text-based. I'm not a nurse, I'm not a medical practitioner. I'm looking at what Cicely Saunders wrote, what she said, looking through things that she read, and looking at how Saunders used total pain and how others have used it since in palliative care, nursing, and pain literature. And so in this talk, I'm going to introduce Saunders and the idea of total pain, and then have a little look at some of the influences and ideas around it, bearing in mind the context we're talking in, which is of the Who Cares exhibition at the Royal College of Nurses. So to introduce Saunders briefly to anyone who's unfamiliar with her, she was from a well-off London family and was studying PPE, philosophy, politics and economics, at Oxford University when war broke out in 1939. She stopped her course and she worked as a VAD in the Voluntary Aid Detachment while waiting to get into the Nightingale School of Nurses at St. Thomas's Hospital in London. She would have loved to continue being a nurse. She loved it there. She was fond of repeating what her biographer, Shirley de Boulay, said about how she took to nursing like a book finding its right place on the shelf. And she made lifelong friendships with those in her set of about 20 nurses in training. However, ongoing problems with her back, including a slipped disc, meant she had to stop, and she retrained after the war as what was then called a lady almoner, what we would think of as a medical social worker. It was while working as a nurse and then a social worker that she found herself dealing with dying patients whose pain was being ignored. And so in the 1950s, in her 30s, she retrained as a doctor in order to carry out research into pain relief and to speak about care for dying people from a position of medical authority. By 1967, she had founded St. Christopher's, where Heather now works, who's going to be our second speaker, which was the world's first research-led teaching hospice that combined cutting-edge pain research into opioids and analgesics with pastoral care and bereavement follow-up and that kind of thing. She was also, in her youth, an evangelical Christian, a position which softened as she got older but was always a driver behind her work. Saunders used total pain as a means of advocating for her own multidisciplinary approach. Total pain was sort of picked up and redescribed by Saunders throughout her career. What I found is that she varied its components depending on who she was talking to, depending on her audience, but it always included physical, psychological, social, and spiritual. And psychological she sometimes calls emotional or mental. At the same time, Saunders asserts that this is a whole overwhelming experience, indivisible into its constituent parts. So it's not just a list, it's one thing. It becomes a rallying cry for Saunders because it articulates how terminal pain from something that you are dying from, unlike acute pain, is a situation rather than an event. There's this sense that it's sort of always tied to the body, but takes place within the wider context of the patient's life. For me, it's such an interesting idea because it uses the medically legitimate pain to introduce Saunders' own brand of medical holism, informed by her nursing and social work. This little sketch I've got up on the right here is from the late 50s, so before she talked about total pain. But you can clearly see that she's thinking about body and mind and the different various things that are feeding into the experience of pain. So some of those red underlined words you've got there, vomiting, weariness, mouth, asphyxia, and then around mind, you've got loss of hope, fear, anxiety, loss of independence, those sorts of things. And so total pain encourages practitioners to understand that emotions such as fear, grief, regret are experienced bodily and so affect how we feel what she sometimes called conventional pain. In its most simple terms, if you increase the tension, if someone's tense and worrying about something, they often do feel some kind of painful lesion more. Moreover, total pain is social. It sort of expresses how pain isn't limited to the dying individual, but extends out to affect those around them. So that's family and friends, kind of obviously, but also from the 1980s, she puts staff pain on that list as well, to sort of describe how those who are giving care are also part of a painful emotional experience. And total pain was radical at a time when medical professionals, doctors especially, routinely deserted the dying. So there's this extract here from a patient's notes given to Saunders during the early 1960s. There is nothing further to be done. This is now a social problem. He cannot go home anymore. He must go into a nursing home. I have therefore explained this to the patient, who has found it a very hard decision to accept. The GP in this case seems unable to understand why the patient wouldn't just go home and die quietly. And Saunders found this kind of attitude was the norm. There's this sort of sense she has that medical science has advanced so much that death becomes seen as a failure, and the physical and emotional effects of a terminal diagnosis are no longer medical problems. Likewise, and Heather can maybe say something about this as well, the routinization of hospice practices after 1967, when Saunders founded St Christopher's, as they've been mainstreamed into palliative care, has raised similar issues. So this type of care that Saunders was talking about is happening not just at St Christopher's, but all over the world, in large hospitals where palliative care is often a sort of para-profession that comes in when needed, and in situations that are not necessarily terminal. So, for example, palliative care plays a big role in respite care for people with chronic conditions. And this is a quote here from Randall and Downey, who one of them is a consultant in palliative medicine and the other is a philosopher, who say that in palliative care in 2006, care which should be expressed from inside a human relationship is becoming an externally imposed intervention. And part of what I've found looking at total pain and how it's used now is the difficulty of teaching this kind of holistic care. It sort of balances a little bit on a knife edge between the practical benefit of breaking down a complicated problem into 4 parts, so that total pain is physical, psychological, social, and spiritual. And total pain is sort of an umbrella term for 4 different types of intervention. But that can sometimes, in some of the literature, kind of ignore the fact that these things are all experienced together, and that total pain is as much about highlighting an individual's personhood, rather. I think what's great about the exhibition that we're talking about is that it foregrounds how Saunders and total pain try to maintain this sense of pain and suffering as a whole overwhelming experience by appealing to the emotions. In fact, Saunders came to total pain by allowing herself to be open to emotional connections with others. She became friends with many of her patients and often refers to them by name in her published papers. This here on the screen is the most famous of those patients, the so-called founding patient of St. Christopher's, David Tajma, who died aged 40 in 1948. I'm not going to say too much about this. You can look on YouTube and there are some really nice videos of Cicely Saunders talking about her relationship with David herself. But effectively, he was a Polish man dying in London with no family and few friends, and he felt he'd wasted his life. Saunders visited him pretty much every evening in his final weeks. She was his medical social worker, and they got talking about how his death could have been better. He was dying on an open ward in a big hospital, and she had this idea that she wanted a home for the dying. He ended up leaving £500 in his will to Saunders to found that home. And famously, he said, "I'll be a window in your home for the dying." Saunders sort of fell in love with David, and subsequently, more seriously, with another Polish man, Antoni Mickiewicz, who was dying in her care in 1960 at St. Joseph's Hospice, Hackney. I can sort of talk more about the tenor of those relationships in the Q&A, but I would argue that such relationships brought home to Saunders the emotional impact on the patient and their family of the processes of dying. Is sort of something that we might accept, but that doctors at the time weren't always accepting. This sense that the patient is a whole other person who it may be possible to have emotionally engaged relationships with, even if you, the medical professional, don't have time or cannot, or perhaps in some of these situations maybe should not have. But this kind of emotional involvement was also present in Saunders' nursing years. Her biographer, David Clark, recounts a story that she told about Reggie, one of many babies who died while she was working on a children's ward with 20 cots during the Second World War. When he died, she couldn't bear for the porter to take him to the mortuary, so she carried him there herself to steady her emotions and pay tribute to his short life. The next morning at 8, she had to break the news to Reggie's parents over the telephone that their only child had died. It's a genuinely really sad story, and you can see how Saunders was emotionally involved in Reggie's care. More generally, since there was almost no curative treatment for cancer and limited pain relief for dying patients, Saunders noticed how the presence and everyday tasks of the nurse could bring relief from pain. Again, in an interview, she says this here: "We really had nothing to offer but ourselves and meticulous nursing." There's that sort of sense of being with, which is often talked about as well. And so this close attention and care she gave as a nurse was consolidated by her work as a medical social worker, helping patients who were struggling to cope at home or with financial difficulties or relationship problems, gave her a sense that a patient's pain doesn't just come from the body. In fact, she once took one of her consultants to see a patient's home to show him the wider context of that patient's problems. And through both of these roles, Saunders learned the importance of establishing a good relationship with the patient and saw how talking to patients can relieve elements of fear and distress that were aggravating their physical pain. And talking also allowed Saunders to gain insight into aspects of suffering that were currently being unaddressed. Some people who don't like the term total pain question whether all its aspects are actually pain, preferring, for example, total suffering. There's a palliative care doctor who I know from Spain who refuses to talk about total pain. It's always total suffering. But actually, total pain reflects Saunders' patients' own use of the word pain in conversation to express their complex suffering. They said, "It was all pain," or "the pain was all round me." And so while other doctors may have deserted the dying because they didn't feel able to deal with the difficult emotions involved, Saunders made a conscious effort to listen and record how her patients were expressing their experience at the end of their lives. She made recordings of hundreds of interviews with dying people and encouraged her staff to record patients' psychosocial progress on separate pink sheets in the clinical notes. So you have the sort of normal clinical notes and then notes on kind of how people were dealing with their illness. And so total pain emerges out of a sort of practice of listening to those ignored by medicine, which provided what I would call emotional evidence that indicated to her the depth and complexity of her pain. And for this reason, sociologist Yasmin Gunaratnam has specifically linked Saunders' research into total pain with narrative-based medicine. Some of you might have heard of narrative medicine or narrative-based medicine. In particular, she sees Saunders' methods of listening and recording her patients as relying on the attention, representation, and affiliation that Rita Sharon, here in the slide, has since articulated as making up narrative competence. And this idea of attention, representation, affiliation is that if we look for and attend to stories and narratives in our practice, and then represent them either back to ourselves in reflective writing, or in the parallel pink notes I was talking about, or as Saunders did in publications and talks, or in things like contemporary Schwartz rounds, we get closer to that other person's experience. We sort of become affiliated through some kind of empathetic connection. Narrative medicine, by the way, is being used in palliative care today in things like dignity therapy or legacy work, in which patients are encouraged to create or record stories from their life with therapeutic benefit, both for them and for those around them. And so here you have Sharon describes narrative competence as a means by which we can recognize, absorb, interpret, and be moved by the stories of illness. And that be moved by portrays how Sharon, like Saunders, is attempting to make space for the emotions within the practice of medicine. My kind of last little bit I'm getting onto now is Saunders was equally aware of the need to establish an emotional connection with others as a means of broadcasting her ideas as advocacy. Total pain was routinely conveyed alongside narrative examples of individual patients. Particularly, you can find them online. I think there's a groundbreaking series of 6 articles in 1959 from the Nursing Times, which was subsequently published as a pamphlet. Such an approach is clear in the story I began with, which was used again and again by Saunders to exemplify total pain. Similar accounts of terminal cancer patients published in the same period might give more detailed factual information about her symptoms or the patient's diagnosis, but this is more powerful because Saunders' patient is so in the room. Saunders allows her to describe her own emotions and relationships, to articulate what her illness means to her. And so unlike conventional case narratives and more like some contemporary accounts in the nursing literature, the narrative Saunders tells prioritize the patient's voice over her own and attempt to connect on a personal rather than a professional level with her audience. I think you can see from that paragraph there, you can kind of really feel that confusion of problems that make up total pain, and so demonstrate Saunders' whole person approach to end-of-life care. In fact, rather than claiming to contribute to scientific knowledge, as a lot of medical cases do, these kind of bits of writing seem almost to be more important in the way they celebrate the uniqueness of the patient. Although some other researchers writing about total pain claim it's a narrative concept, as I've sort of said, and that's kind of true, but Saunders doesn't just use narratives. If you look through all her publications, as I have, she's more likely to demonstrate using a short quote without context. Mrs. Hinson is often, "All of me is wrong." Others, "It was all pain. I was in a vice. Will you turn me out if I cannot get better? The whole house is full of her pain." And we can quibble over whether those are narrative or not, but it's more important that they are individual expressions of pain given to us as reported speech. Indeed, as you can see there, Saunders also utilizes photographs and descriptions of body language like gripped hands or lack of eye contact to communicate total pain instead. If you do make it to the exhibition, when it reopens, there are some great photographs by Sir Christopher's photographer Derek Bays, many of which Saunders used in her publications, and they let you connect with Saunders' work in a way that most writing, particularly by doctors at the time, I don't think would have allowed. And so as a means of convincing the medical community to focus on dying patients, Saunders is using a different type of medical evidence. Feelings are facts in this house, she often says, and they're often the most powerful facts in a whole situation. And so in suggesting that clinicians attend to feelings as well as biomedical facts, Saunders shares her medical authority with the patient, and they are just as much an expert as she is, in a way that leads the Australian nursing professor Kim Devery to say that Saunders demonstrates it's possible for a medical professional to be both expert and human. That's that line at the bottom there. And so I think it's this bothness, this being expert and being human, which I think is at the core of total pain, as a kind of medical holism, as something that makes you think about holistic care. Total pain can be thought of in 2 ways. Firstly, as a cognitive holism, this idea that pain is an overwhelming experience made up of intersecting, contributing factors that are physical, emotional, social, spiritual, that may require different or multiple interventions by a multidisciplinary team. But it's also a cultural holism that marks out hospice and palliative care as distinctive by emphasizing its social purpose that recognizes personhood and the importance of relationships alongside good medical care, or even as a part of good medical care. And so although her research into pain was innovative, I think that her nursing experience and her experience as a social worker was in many ways at the heart of that second type of total pain. She suggests that sometimes hard emotions require persistence with the practical, or simply being with. And that's clearly a result of spending time alongside patients as part of her mixed career background. And so I hope this talk has been useful in some ways in suggesting that I think what total pain does is remind practitioners, even today when there's a growing empirical research base for palliative medicine, that when someone is dying or someone knows someone who is dying, these are sometimes people who are experiencing some of the strongest, most complex emotions that they've ever gone through. And these emotions need to be acknowledged and witnessed. And some criticisms of the use of total pain are about it being totalizing, of offering up a whole person's life to medicine. But I think it's often about not knowing everything, but realizing, as Saunders often said, that it is never true to say that there is nothing more to be done. And so I think I will end there with that idea of feelings are facts in this house. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joe. Our second speaker is Heather Richardson, Joint Chief Executive of St. Christopher Hospice, which was founded by Cicely Saunders.
Thank you very much, Joe, and thank you for the invitation to speak this evening. On the 14th of July in 2005, the New York Times announced Cicely Saunders' death, aged 87. She was at St. Christopher's Hospice and she died of breast cancer. And they asserted that end-of-life care had been reshaped. And of course, as Joe described, and many of you will know, she was seminal, she was extraordinary in her work. But a question remains, which is, was the job done? She defined pain, she modelled best practice, she established an evidence base, she shone a light on the needs of people who were ignored or forgotten. But as I say, the question is left about the degree to which there was more that we could do. And the sadness for me is that I continue to see suffering around end of life, and I'm sure many of you do too, which is why you are part of this talk. Last year, I had the privilege to spend time in a busy teaching hospital, and I witnessed suffering of the proportions that I found alarming. It was no reflection at all on the care on offer in that hospital. It was much more about the nature of dying today and the system response that exists. So the gentleman in this photograph depicts a man. He was dying of leukemia. The team caring for him had failed to recognise that, focusing instead on the many different interventions they could offer that might sustain his life. And consequently, he and his family were unprepared. They were dispersed across the globe when he died in ITU, with only a few of the most important people in his life around him. This gentleman was in his late 80s. He had a learning disability. He lived in a care home about 10 miles away from the hospital, and he had had a stroke. And he'd been fast-tracked into a tertiary hospital as part of a very exciting pathway of care. And he found himself dying alone in ITU, a context quite unfamiliar to him and a far cry from the place that he would have wanted to be. And my third picture is of a man that I met who had practiced self-management very successfully to address severe pain that he had, arising in a tumour in his chest. Now in hospital for further tests, he was denied the opportunity to manage the symptoms that he had himself. And those tears that he's crying were reflective of his frustration, his fear of the pain returning, and the lack of agency that he had in that context to change any of that whilst he was in hospital. And the bad news is that this isn't only a problem for people living in the area of that hospital. It's global. And there are significant inequalities, particularly around access to opioids and other drugs that could make a significant difference that exist across the world. The bad news is that suffering is extensive as a consequence of this. And the good news is that the majority of this could be redressed. We just have to have the appetite. It could be argued that pain which is unrecognized and therefore unaddressed is perhaps some of the worst. We have a significant group of people emerging who need care at the end of life, who live into late old age, and their needs are both complicated and significant. Caroline Nicholson, who has written the paper that I've copied into this, and her colleagues articulate very beautifully the challenges that very old people face, that need to balance continuity of life in the face of ongoing loss. And their pain sits in their growing dependency, the social isolation that they often experience, the loss of position that they have in family and society more generally. And the photograph, which I've put on the left-hand side, where that much older woman, she remembers herself as the young woman in the shadow, but most people fail to see that person as they look at her. One of the features of contemporary end of life is the chronicity of many conditions, including cancer. And that's no longer a fast killer disease, but one which can be being an experience of chronic illness, an extended period of dying, and what I call social death, a related social death. This is a quote from somebody that I interviewed as part of my PhD a long time ago now, who spoke very powerfully of the experience of dying socially before he died in his body. And he says, the thing about this diagnosis is that it goes on too long. It's a funny thing to say because you'd think the longer you live, the better. But for everybody, my wife, my family, it's gone on too long. This has been the loneliest time in my life, and I've been surrounded with the most people. It's knowing how to cope with them. It's knowing how they're going to cope with you. It's strange all round. My wife is angry with me because I've got this and because I don't work like I used to. And she's angry because she can't do anything about it. And that's the worst bit. And I won't forget him for a very long time because of the articulated nature of his stories to me about his experience of dying and its longevity. Despite, I guess, significant recent efforts recently towards greater inclusivity in our society, there are some groups of people who live on the margins whose end of life is particularly grim as a result. I had an opportunity to work on a very interesting project called Better Endings, run by the Innovation Unit, where it was looking at people's experience of living and dying. And we spoke to people that lived on the margins, people who were socially excluded or who were often forgotten in society. And the conversations that we had with people who were homeless, who were part of the sex industry, who had no recourse to public funds, confirmed a whole range of challenges that contributed to a very poor end of life and to significant pain. They often had little or no voice. They often had very poor connections with formal health services. They quite often lived in poverty and very often in isolation. The gentleman in this photograph is a man called Brian, and I interviewed him and a woman that was involved in his daily life. She ran a drop-in centre, and one of the researchers on the project and I went to visit them. And he talked a lot about his pain around lack of legacy. his fear of not being remembered, of the shame and the disconnection that he felt from his family, and of feeling that he hadn't achieved enough in his life. And I included in here a quote from Sarah, who had huge insight into the pain of these people at the end of life. Her comment, "Life is short. When someone doesn't come back, they're easily forgotten. No one asks for them anymore. It's assumed they're either in hospital, in prison, or dead. They become a rumour." And for Brian, that was his biggest fear, of dying and nobody attending his funeral and nobody even noticing that he no longer lived in this world. It would be remiss if I didn't talk a little bit about COVID-19 and the fact that it's brought so much of this suffering into the spotlight. And I want to just mention the fact that the risk of being seriously ill or dying through COVID is greater for some groups, and that's a reality, as is suffering. The opportunities to be connected or involved are denied for many families. Important rituals have been lost, particularly in bereavement, and the speed of death and its seemingly random nature have made people frightened and really anxious. And I was very struck by an article I read in The Guardian right at the beginning of lockdown, where they talked about its grief upon grief. And I have met a number of people who have really found the fact that they couldn't say goodbye to people in person desperately painful. And Cicely Saunders always spoke of the fact that it's how people live after the death of somebody that's the important litmus of good end of life. And I think we're going to see a lot of people that struggle in their bereavement as a consequence of what's happened recently. So that's the doomsday and the kind of sad reality, but I do see some real sources of hope, and I'm going to talk about that now. And I'm going to talk also about what some of the role of nurses might be in taking forward some of this important work. And I want to start with some of the things that I think are really inspirational. The photograph on the left is a picture of a public engagement program in end of life that exists in Kerala in southern India. It's a network of local people led by a very small number of health professionals, and they achieve an extraordinary coverage of people that are at the end of life and need help. And what you see there at the heart of that work are the kind of relationships that Joe spoke about so passionately a little bit earlier. The second picture is of a piece of work that has been led by Caroline Nicholson, an academic at Surrey, who I quoted earlier. And she's been doing a lot of work on age-attuned hospice and palliative care. That she's been looking quite critically at the interface between frailty and palliative care. And there are many ways in which some of the principles that Cicely and others have really generated and built over the last 50 years can be translated into very, very high quality care for this growing group of people who live into late old age and desperately need some help. Compassionate Neighbours in Hackney is the kind of English equivalent of the work in India. And I've been very privileged to be part of that and seen a lot of highly reciprocal live relationships that have transformed people's lives, both people that are dying, but also the people that are involved in befriending and looking after them. There's a palliative care toolkit developed for homeless people from St Mungo's, which I think is really very, very helpful and starts to help people that are outside the traditional worlds of palliative care make end-of-life care better for others. And this is a picture of a memorial done by some healthcare workers who work with sex workers, and there are many deaths in that group, often unacknowledged and often outside the health system. And this was a memorial for one of those sex workers, and it was very, very well attended. And I saw there an attention to the pain of people left behind who know that they're not far behind this lady. Nurses have a really important role in taking these forward, and I've identified 4 things that I think are absolutely crucial for us to do. The first is that we have got to see and respond to the potential for change, not just for individual patients and their families, but for organisations and the systems in which they receive care. Nurse colleagues and other members of the MDT need to understand the value of dying. Jo spoke very clearly of the lack of value placed on dying in Cicely's early days and her ambition to change that. And I think that we have to hold that today. It's not accepted. And certainly those people that I witnessed dying in a hospital, it wasn't that people weren't concerned for them, but the opportunity to recognise dying is often lost in a timely way. We need to see the potential of an expanded role beyond hands-on care. And most importantly, I think we've got a real opportunity to be pioneers and to reduce pain and suffering at the end of life in the way that Cicely Saunders did. We've so many people to learn from. Jo has spoken of Florence Nightingale and Cicely Saunders, and I've also been reading recently Mary Seacle's work, and there are many other nurses that you all have met in your professional life, you might have met personally, who might have been inspirational to you, that we can draw on and learn from for contemporary purposes. Some of the work that I've been doing recently at St Christopher's has been to look critically at the life of Florence Nightingale and Cicely Saunders and see what attributes they both shared. One of them, I've got a list of 8. None of them are surprising in themselves, but I think the fact that both of them were so committed, for example, to public health, to being critical thinkers, to being campaigners and super connectors, as well as being compassionate nurses and protagonists for excellent care, is part of what makes them truly pioneering. We've also been involved in developing a contemporary model of nursing at the end of life. We're just at the beginning of this work and we're going to test it, and anybody who's interested to do that, I would genuinely love to hear from you. But in that, we focus very much on redressing pain and suffering by working towards outcomes that are meaningful to people, being mindful of a very changing context of life, death and loss. And the models that were appropriate 10, 20, 30 years ago simply don't reflect the kind of shift that I was describing earlier. We need to fine-tune processes of nursing care, and this model provides that, work with MDT colleagues, develop ourselves as practitioners, and ensure as leaders that the right conditions exist to help nurses flourish where we work. And there are 2 very strong tenets that need to weave their way all the way through this. One is a strong philosophy of end-of-life care, but the second, and I think this really relates to Jo's work, is about finding the person in the patient. This is a quote from Cicely: suffering is only intolerable when nobody cares. And our sense in this model is that the nurse must bring themselves to that person in order to connect with the suffering and to show that they do indeed care it. There are 5 processes of nursing in it, and I'm not going to talk about those now. We need to finish. But I did want to say something just in closing, that what connects all these processes of care are engagement and relationships between the nurse and the person or the people with whom they're caring. And when Cicely began her work, as Jo articulated, she placed absolute priority on relationships, the relationships that she had personally, the relationships that she utilized in her work, and the relationships she developed with her patients. And she talked about being with, she talked about the value of presence, and Joe talked about empathetic connection. And I've spoken here about authentic engagement, and it's much the same thing. Darren Hayland from Canada says, when a nurse is authentically engaged with a patient and their family, this means that the nurse enacts a relational practice that's characterized by curiosity, humility, concern, commitment, investment, and action. And I think that is our role and our opportunity and our responsibility as we try and do some of the same work that Cicely began 50 or so years ago. Thank you.